If you are new with us, if this is your first time to be with us, we're in a message series on the Gospel of John, and our philosophy of preaching ministry is to work our way through whole book Bible study. So it's to take a book of the Bible, not to skip around in it, but to take it chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And I'm more of a teacher by nature, so I want to teach you what the passage says. I want to address some of the complexities and difficulties in the passage, help us all to understand it, and then figure out a way to apply it not only to our individual lives, but to the life of your family and your life group, and then the church at large. But then we'll intersperse whole book Bible studies with more of a thematic study. So what is a real life issue that we all struggle with, and what does God's word have to say about it? Well, right now we're in the middle of a whole book Bible study. We're studying the Gospel of John. And if you missed any of these messages, you can go on our church app or online. You can get caught up on all the messages for free. But we're studying through this gospel together. By the time that we're done, when we button it all up, it'll be about 33 or 34 weekends. But we're dividing it into parts. And I'm going to take a break a couple of times. I'm going to take a break around Christmas and do a Christmas series. At the beginning of the year, we're going to do a relationships and marriage series. It's been a while since we've addressed that subject. And last week, I don't know if you know this or not, I didn't mention it, but we finished part one of this series. And you're just like the rest of the services. You're all excited about that, I can tell. What we've done is the title of this whole series is God Became Man. The Gospel of John, God Became Man. But part one is face to face with God. So John wants us to know, he gets right out of the gates in chapter 1, and he tells us who Jesus is. Jesus is not some ordinary guy. He's not just another run-of-the-mill teacher. Jesus is the logos logic of God, which means that in the Old Testament, God is all mysterious and difficult to understand and sounds a little irritable at times, and God doesn't make full sense until we get Jesus. Jesus is the logic of God. Jesus is from God, he is God, he's the Messiah, he's the Lamb, and so John gives us these narrative accounts where Jesus is talking to these people and they slowly come to realize that he's God. Nicodemus didn't realize it at first. The woman at the well didn't realize it at first. And Jesus flat out says to her, you are face to face with God. That was part one. Well, today, as we are finishing up John chapter 4, and as we launch into chapter 5, it's part 2 of this series, Face to Face with Life. And how many of you would agree with me that life can be painful, disappointing, and difficult at times? How many of you would just agree with that statement? I'm looking around the room to see if there's anybody that did not raise their hands, because if you did not raise your hand, I want to know what you're drinking, all right? I want to know what kind of la land you live in, because at the very least, whether you agree with everything I say today or not, you've at least got to agree with that life can be crushing, it can be difficult, you can get the emotional wind knocked out of you. And what John wants us to see is that God himself is not immune from that Jesus is God in the flesh, and Jesus faced some incredible disappointment, betrayal, and difficulty himself. In fact, it's in John's gospel that the shortest verse in the Bible is found. It's only 2 words, Jesus wept. Jesus broke down and he shared our grief, he shared our pain and our suffering. Now, one of the things I want you to see, especially as we get into chapter 5, chapter 5 is a pivot point in the gospel. There is this growing hostility. It's like a thunderstorm on the horizon that is beginning to brew. It's beginning to build up momentum towards Jesus that will eventually lead to his crucifixion. So that's kind of the larger story going on as we look at these 2 narratives here this morning. And what I love about John is that he was in no rush to write his gospel. John was likely a teenager when he followed Jesus. He was a teenager when Jesus went to a cross. And if I would have been John, as soon as Jesus ascended up into heaven, I would have been like, man, I gotta write my gospel right now. I want to tell people about him. But John didn't do that. John waits until he's well into his 80s before he writes his gospel. He is marinated in his relationship with Jesus. So what he writes is birthed out of wisdom, it's birthed out of experience, it's birthed out of compassion. And John is writing to a Greek culture that had largely dismissed Jesus. They chalked it up as foolishness. It mirrors our culture today. And so this gospel is perfect for wherever you might be in your belief system. We've been saying that the Gospel of John is kind of like a swimming pool. And there's a deep end and there's a shallow end, and it's an all swim. We can all get in and find something that will nourish us wherever you might be in your beliefs. And so as you look at the four Gospels, they all have a theme. And Matthew, if we were to break it down, we would see that Matthew was the gospel of maybe fulfilled prophecy. Matthew chapter 1 begins with this extended Old Testament genealogy, and you're scratching your head going, why in the world would you begin a gospel that way? But Matthew knew his audience. He knew that they would have known those Jewish names. And Matthew wants us to see that Jesus is the Old Testament Messiah that's been prophesied. He wants them to see the connections. Mark would be the gospel of events. Mark is real rapid paced. I mean, if you have a short attention span, read Mark. Mark is just like, give me the facts, ma'am, just give me the facts. He just writes it down, just blows right through it, typical guy, all right? Then you got Luke, and Luke is the most well-educated of all of them. He's a physician, and he's funded by a wealthy benefactor named Theophilus. And so Theophilus says, here's your expense account. Go travel where you need to travel. Go interview who you need to interview. Just give me an orderly account of what Jesus said and did. So Luke would be the gospel of accuracy. If that's true for those first three guys, John is the gospel of belief. John wants us to come to believe in Jesus Christ. He wants to show us who he is and why it matters. And so the thesis of this gospel is found in chapter 20, verse 31. John says, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so what John does is he doesn't just say, hey, you need to believe, the end. John actually takes us through these narratives, these stories that helps us to see these people and how they travel from skepticism or unbelief to belief. John shows us the barriers that commonly exist and how they systematically can come down in our lives. And so John would say to us in John chapter 14, we'll get to that passage sometime in this series, he would say that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to God the Father except through him. So what he is saying very clearly and unapologetically is that Jesus is the only way of our salvation, which is an explosive thing to say in our very tolerant culture. You want to get punched in the jaw, just say that multiple times in the face of somebody else. And the reason why you might get punched, or at the very least have their eyes roll at you, is it sounds like you're saying, my belief system is superior to yours. And if that's what that means, then I don't blame them for punching you. But that's not what that statement means. John 14, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through him, is a statement of identity. That Jesus is God in the flesh. Everybody else that taught a belief system, taught a philosophy or a worldview was merely a human teaching a system of beliefs. Jesus is God in the flesh who is prescribing a prescription for what has gone wrong with humanity and says, I've come to bridge the gap between broken humanity and a holy God. In other words, he's the door. That Jesus came to live the life that you and I attempted to live but cannot live. He came to die the death we were supposed to die so that now he removes our filthy rags and clothes us in his righteousness. That's why he's the way. So let me say it this way, and let me just draw your attention in case you've started to glaze over or daydream or think about the Colts game coming up here in an hour and a half, and I'll have you out of here, all right? I want you to think about this, and this is gonna sound a little odd, especially to you church folk, all right? Emphasis on the folk, all right? You church folk, this is gonna sound a little odd, but I want this to sink in, all right? Jesus is the only way to God, but there are multiple ways to Jesus. There are multiple paths that lead to him. John wants us to see that there is not a one-size-fits-all recipe. And some of you know this to be true, that in your lives, faith came very easy for you. It was not a struggle, it was not difficult, it came quickly, and you were able to jump right in and place your belief in Jesus Christ. Others of you, it has been a real struggle. And maybe you've taken 3 steps forward and maybe 2.5 steps back in your journey towards belief. Maybe there's been some moments when you felt really, really close, and then there's been some moments where you've drifted away and it's gone cold again. And John just wants us to see, hey man, stay with it, stay with it. Everybody's path to Jesus might look just a little bit different, but man, stay on the path. Bring your questions, bring your hurts, bring your baggage to Jesus Christ. That's the whole thesis of this gospel, and it's why we're spending so much time in it as a church. And so to set up what we're gonna look at today, we're gonna begin in chapter 4, verse 46. If you were here last week, then you know that Jesus and his disciples were in Judea. They were traveling up north to Galilee. They did not go around Samaria, but they went straight up through it. And Jesus stopped at Sychar. He meets a woman with a reputation at a well, and her life dramatically changes. She goes back into town as a missionary, and it says in chapter 4, verse 42, that the people say to Jesus, we initially believed because her life changed, but now that's not necessarily the case. Now we believe because of your word. And Jesus has a really successful couple of days in Sychar because all these people are coming to believe. He does not get that kind of response in Galilee, which ironically is his home turf. And so Jesus goes back up into Galilee. He's from Nazareth. About 10 miles north of Nazareth is a place called Cana. This is where Jesus did his first miracle. He changed the water to wine back in chapter 2. And to the north and the east of Cana is a place called Capernaum. And that's the setting where we meet a royal official and his sick son. So pick it up with me in chapter 4, verse 46. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water to wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So this is not a head cold. This is not a flu. This is a very serious illness. Verse 48, so Jesus says to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Now that sounds like kind of an odd thing for Jesus to say to a guy that's hurting, don't you think? And here's this guy, he's come and he says, Jesus, I've got a sick son at home. And Jesus there's a number of ways that he could have responded. He could have said, for starters, he could have said, man, I'm so sorry to hear that. Jesus could have been pastoral in this moment. He could have said, tell me more about it. What is it that he's struggling with? But instead, Jesus says, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. It feels like a little bit of a jab. And what we have to understand is that Jesus senses the spiritual indifference in this location, and it's miffed him just a little bit. Because see, he did this miracle in Cana, changed the water to wine. That's his first miracle, and people are still talking about it. People are still like, hey, Jesus came back to Cana. What else is he gonna do? What's part 2 of this show? And so they get their popcorn, they get the tickets to the front row. They wanna see Jesus do another show like he's some sort of, like the Blue Man Group in Vegas or something. And Jesus is irritated by it. That's why he says this. He's like, well, I guess you're just looking for a sign. You'll only believe in me if I show you some sort of a sign. And the official says to him, he doesn't seem to be fazed by that. He says in verse 49, sir, come down before my child dies. Now, John does not specifically identify this guy, but he calls him a royal official. And the idea that we get is that he is a Jewish official, more than likely in Herod's court, which means that he was very wealthy. It means that he was powerful. It means that he had a privileged position. And the odds are pretty great that he had probably already been a part of a few private meetings with some of his colleagues, some of the higher ups, that were trying to figure out how to get rid of Jesus. More than likely, he had been a part of some discussions. There was an email chain. Hey, Jesus is growing in popularity. What are we going to do about this guy? And he knew that was going on, but his whole perspective changes when his son gets sick. And chances are he had already sent his son to some of the best medical professionals that that time period could offer. None of it has worked. Basically, the doctors have said, why don't you take him home? Why don't you spend some quality time with your son in the time that he has left? And the life had drained from his face. He was not as responsive as he was before. And this guy gets desperate. And what this is, understand, Capernaum was about 20 to 25 miles away from Cana. This guy does not send an assistant. This guy does not send a messenger. He goes himself. Now, 25 miles is not a big deal to us because we could hop in a car and be there in about 15 minutes. But on foot in the first century, this would have taken an extended amount of time for him to travel. This is a Hail Mary pass. The guy's desperate. And what I want you to see here is that if it wasn't for his dying son, he probably never would have bothered with Jesus. And so Jesus says to him in verse 50, go, your son will live. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm the royal official, I'd want something a little more substantial than that. Like if I'm coming to you and I'm like, man, my son is sick, and notice what he asked him, and Jesus totally avoided it. He said, would you come with me? Hey, come with me home. Come with me to my son's bedside because I believe you'll heal him, but I need you to be present to heal him. Now, here's the thing about this guy. He oftentimes gets a bad rap. I'm studying the commentators on this guy. Some of the commentators love him. Some of the commentators dislike him because they're not quite sure what his motivations are. But I have to say at least this. The guy does have quite a bit of belief. I think it's because he's in a desperate situation here. Keep in mind, Jesus has not healed anybody yet. He's only changed water to wine. And this guy says, you know what, you've done that. Maybe you could heal my son, but you got to come with me. And Jesus says, go, your son will live. Does that not sound like a blow off to you? I'm kind of like, oh, come on, dude. I mean, could you put something in writing? Can you give me a money back guarantee? All right, now we would just probably text our loved ones and say, hey, Jesus said that he's going to live. Can you go in and check on Johnny and see? I don't know if his name is Johnny. I'm just assuming. All right, can you go in? And some of you are like, I didn't see that in the Bible. But let's just go. Maybe his name is Johnny. Can you go in? Can you check and see if Johnny's recovering? Can you see if he's doing well? Because if he's not, I'm not going to travel the 25 miles back. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to continue to pester this guy until he heals him. But notice what it says here. It says, the man what? The man believed. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him. And not only believed it, but he went on his way. He took some sort of action here. Why in the world would he do that? Could you imagine how long of a journey that would be home, not knowing? Not knowing if your son was getting any better or not. And by the time he would get back to Capernaum, if he wasn't recovering, it would be too late for him to turn right around and make the 25-mile journey back to Cana to ask Jesus once again. Now, here's what I think is going on. I think this guy got into the presence of Jesus, and he felt, could I say it this way? He felt the weight of his person. I think that he gets around Jesus, and he's like, man, there is some substance to this dude. Have you ever been around somebody with an incredible amount of integrity, an incredible amount of character, an incredible amount of insight, and you can just feel it? Like they make you feel like you're the most important person in the world. You feel safe with them. You're like, man, you don't know exactly how to articulate it, but you would just say, there's a weightiness to this person. I think Jesus had that with this guy. I think that's why he believed so easily. This says that he believed and he went on his way. And so notice what happens here is that he comes to Jesus on his terms, and Jesus says, no, we'll do this on my terms. And notice what it says in verse 51. As he was going down, or as he was going back to Capernaum, his servants met him. So the idea here is that the boy is recovering, and the servants are like, let's travel to Cana and tell the father that he's doing well. And so they meet about halfway or so, and they tell him that his son is recovering. Verse 52. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better. And they said to him, yesterday. Now, does that seem odd to anybody? What this seems to be implying is that the dude got a hotel room and spent the night and said, I'll head back the next day. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm in a desperate situation, I want my son to be healed, and Jesus says, go, he'll live, I want to rush right back home and to see if he's getting better. But there was this degree to which he believed Jesus that a peace came over him, and he said, well, I'll get a good night's rest and then I'll travel back the next day. That appears as what is happening here. And they say, well, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. And the father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And then it says this, and he himself believed and all his household. Now, I don't know about you, but the end of verse 53 is extremely frustrating to me. Because I'm like, come on, John, can't you give us any more detail than that? And the guy believed and his whole household? John, if you're writing a gospel trying to help people come to believe, why don't you tell us a little bit more about this guy's testimony? John, why don't you go back and tell us about the conversations that he had with his wife and his kids and his neighbors? That'd be a pretty good baptism video, John. It's like, hey, man, he came back, and Johnny's color started coming back to his face. And, man, we said, tell us about this Jesus, and he taught us about his word, and we were all in. I mean, just what an incredible testimony. Now, have you noticed that this is John's pattern? That when Jesus spoke to Nicodemus, he didn't really wrap it up, didn't put a bow on it, didn't tell us exactly what Nicodemus did with the information. He gave us a little more info with a woman at the well, but not a whole lot. And now with the royal official, he just says, yeah, he came to believe and so did his household. The end. Now, come on, John, give us some more info. Why do you think John's doing this? And I think this is the reason why. John is saying, look, these people are precious, these people are important, but they are not the main event. And what has a tendency of happening is that when we hear an incredible testimony, we have a tendency to focus upon that testimony maybe more so than the Christ behind the testimony. John says, man, don't walk away from here thinking much of the royal official and his family. Think much of the Christ. Think much of him. I don't want you distracted by the details of their story here. And it's kind of like sermon illustrations for me. Sermon illustrations, man, I do a lot of preaching. And what a sermon illustration should be is when I notice some eyes glazing over in the room, I gotta bring you back somehow, all right? I need some smelling salts, all right? And so I'll try to, I don't know, a fair amount of illustrations just come to me impromptu, which is always very, very scary because you don't exactly know how they're gonna go. They work beautifully or they blow up in your face. It's a great deal of fun. It's like playing Russian roulette, all right? And so what ends up happening with sermon illustrations is when I notice that you're drifting, when I notice that I'm not getting you anymore, I'll try to open up a window for there to be some fresh air. Because it's kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant, and I want you to go, oh, I get it. Now, here's the double-edged sword of the illustrations. They can hijack the whole sermon if I'm not careful. And all of a sudden, you walk out if you're thinking, man, that illustration was so interesting, that illustration was so funny, that illustration was so offensive. I'm going to email him, and he shouldn't have used that, all right? But that happens from time to time, and I appreciate your grace. But one of the things as a preacher that I have to repent of all the time is maybe I let that illustration become the main event rather than the principle. This is, I think, what's happening here with these miracles, with these changed lives, is John's like, yes, it's great. Yes, it's fantastic. But listen, they're not the point. Jesus is the point. See, John writes this in such a way you could write your story in. And there's a little bit of you in Nicodemus. There's a little bit of me and the woman at the well. There's a little bit of us and the royal official. John says, don't miss the Christ. So as we go on to chapter 5, this is where the brewing hostility is going to begin building towards Jesus, and we see why. What we see here in chapter 5 is Jesus showing an incredible amount of compassion and picking a fight at the same time. I love that about Jesus. He is much more than the Mr. Rogers of the first century, all right? Jesus comes and he picks a fight with the Jewish establishment and he shows compassion and grace. What I want you to see as we read this is that what happens next is a parable of salvation. It's a real life parable. So look at chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda. Now Bethesda means a house of mercy or house of grace. And this pool has 5 roofed colonnades. So it's these roofs that provided some cover from the sunlight around the area of the pool. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Well, if I'm teaching this verse, one of the things I might just draw your attention to is John uses the word is. He says there is in Jerusalem a sheep gate and a pool. And what this is signifying is that he is writing to a culture of skeptics, and he says, look, it's about 85, 90 AD when John writes this. He's writing about an event that took place in 28 AD, so this is 60 years later. About 25 years after this, Jerusalem was initially destroyed. John says to the Greek culture, hey, you know that sheep gate and that pool that you've walked by? This is where that happened. He's showing them some history here. And the pool of Bethesda, we've got a picture of what it would have looked like then with the 5 roofed colonnades. And then we've got a picture of excavated ruins of it. It was sort of like, we get this idea that it was a pool built over maybe some sort of a spring or a hot springs. My family loves Colorado, and every time we go to Colorado, we try to venture our way to Glenwood Springs. And in Glenwood Springs, there is a natural hot spring at the base of the mountain that they built a swimming pool around. It's been there since the early 1900s. And on one side of the pool, the water is warm, but it's not as warm as the side closest to the source of the hot springs. If you go to that side of the pool, it's almost so hot you can't even be in it. And this is what I kind of visualize with the pool of Bethesda. It's this pool built over a spring, and there are people with physical ailments that have gathered around the pool. And apparently, periodically, the pool would bubble up at the source of the spring, and they would get into the water thinking there was something mysterious in the water that might heal them, but more than likely, it just felt therapeutic to their hurting bodies. And so Jesus walks up to this pool. There's all kinds of hurting people with physical ailments laying around the pool, and he picks out one guy. Look what it says in verse 5. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years, and when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Which is an extremely odd question, because you would think that would be a no-brainer. This guy has been an invalid for 38 years. My guess is that he was probably 38 years old, about my age. And he had been an invalid his whole life. He couldn't walk. And Jesus walks up to him. Now understand, Jesus can see into our hearts. He knows what's there. He says to this guy, "Do you want to be healed?" This guy has no clue who Jesus is. In fact, it seems like he only does way late into the game. And Jesus comes up to him. He's like, "Hey man, do you want to be healed?" It's the same question. This is a parable of salvation. And Jesus is searching for us long before you ever search for him. Now notice the response that this guy gives to him. It's kind of a weird response. Verse 7, the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Now, did he answer the question? I don't know. It seems like a simple yes or no. Do you want to be healed? Yes, no. What he does is he has a little bit of a pity party for himself, and he says, "Well, nobody will carry me down into the pool, and every time the water bubbles up and I try to get in, somebody just butts in front of me." And Jesus doesn't even acknowledge the guy's excuse. Look at what he says. Verse 8, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Here's what I want you to see. Nowhere did the guy ask for it. Nowhere did Jesus say, "Okay, you need to muster up some more faith and then I'll do this." Jesus just did it. It is an example of his sovereign grace in this guy's life. The guy didn't even know what really hit him before Jesus came. So in this, we have a tendency to think that if God is gonna move, if he's gonna stir in my life, if he's gonna bring me to a place of belief, if God is gonna heal me, if he's gonna change my circumstances, then I better get my act together. I better muster up some faith and bring it to the table and see what he'll do. But in this instance, it's not the faith that brings the healing, it's the healing that brings the faith. Now look at what it says to finish up this passage in verse 9. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." That's real compassionate, all right? This guy's been laying there at the pool every day. He's an invalid, 38 years. They wouldn't know who he is. And all of a sudden he comes walking up, his legs fully restored. You'd think that they would at least go, "Whoa, this is pretty cool." But instead they're like, "How dare you be healed on the Sabbath? Lay back down," all right? There's just no compassion here. Verse 11, this just reveals to us this guy still, he just does not know what happened to him. Verse 11, he answered them, "The man who healed me," he didn't even know Jesus' name. He's like, "Well, the man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Still kind of making excuses, it seems. "Well, I didn't do this, he did it." No, go talk to him. Verse 12, they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn and there was a crowd in the place. Which I find that fascinating. For starters, Jesus could have walked into the pool of Bethesda, blew his lifeguard whistle, and said, "Everybody get into the pool, I'm gonna do a mass healing." But he does not do that. He only walks up to one guy, "Hey, get up." He doesn't do like this abracadabra thing. He just says, "Hey, get up, take your mat and walk." And he disappears into the crowd. It's as if he doesn't want to draw attention to it. And afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you're well." And I would imagine Jesus put both hands on the guy's shoulders and got this big smile on his face like, "Hey man, see, you're well, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." That's not like this idea of like a checklist of sins. This is this idea of, man, I healed your physical body. Now, will your spirit be healed? Do you realize what happened? And the man went away and he told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And that sets off this controversy that's going to eventually take Jesus to a cross. So that's the text. Let me give you 4 handles of application this morning that I want you just to think about and marinate upon. This is what I'd want you to discuss in your life groups. I want you to just do some personal meditation and thinking about these things. 4 handles of application that come right out of the teaching that we just looked at. Here's the first one. Jesus often uses painful circumstances to awaken us to spiritual realities. And we see that with both the royal official and the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. One of the things that I know to be true in this room right now that I just look across is that represented in this room right now this morning is a fair amount of pain and a fair amount of disappointment and a fair amount of confusion. We do a pretty good job of hiding it, especially at church. I think we're kind of trained to do that. But if I were to pull back the veil, and if we were to see everybody's collective pain that's just in this room, the weight of it would more than likely crush us. And I know right now what some of you are dealing with, what you brought in here with you, what has been the running commentary in the back of your mind as you've been listening to me teach, is what am I going to do? And some of you, your marriages are beginning to crumble. Nobody knows it except for you and your spouse. Some of you are sitting in the ashes of a crumbled marriage as we speak. Some of you have a child that is off the rails and you don't know how to bring them back. Some of you have faced some sort of difficulty in your career. Some of you had somebody say something to you this last week that punched you in the soul and it has decimated you and you're trying to figure out how to recover from it. Some of you are dealing with depression all alone. Some of you are dealing with addiction. There is pain, disappointment. Some of you are bothered right now. You don't even know why. There is pain and suffering in this world. And ironically, I would say that maybe one of the top 3 most common reasons that I hear from people in their struggles to come to belief and place their faith in Jesus is this issue of pain and suffering. Meaning that if there was a God, why does it exist and why won't he take it away? And it is a very complex issue that you cannot answer with trite, simplistic answers. And I've studied the issue, I've studied the theology of it, I've sat under lectures and I've tried to learn as much as I could, but I tell you, the thing that's taught me more about this particular issue is becoming a father of 4 kids. And one of the struggles of being a dad, I've got 4 kids at home. They're 12, 10, 7, and 2. And a little over 12 years ago, when my wife came into the bedroom with a little stick, and it said positive, and she said, surprise, you're gonna be a daddy. And then when I came to, all right, one of the things that I noticed was she was thinking about the immediate, I was thinking of the long term, right? She's figuring out what the baby's room is gonna look like, I'm thinking about college. Right? She's thinking about what kind of stroller we're gonna get. I'm thinking about the poor young man who asked my daughter on a date, all right? That's what I'm thinking about. And I'm fast forwarding, looking through all this. And the thing that hit me, I'd never thought about it before, but it continues to reoccur, is simply this. And this was the struggle that I had. Some of you can relate to this. It's like, okay, I'm gonna bring a child into the world, and there is nothing that I can do to insulate them from pain and suffering. And yet this is like this impulse within me as a dad to do that. And already at the ages of 12, 10, 7, and 2, every single one of my kids have already had broken hearts. Every single one of them have come home with tears in their eyes. Every single one of them have had somebody say something to them that has wounded them. And everything within me as a father wants to insulate, wants to protect, wants to keep them from that spirit of brokenness. Now here's the thing. I also know as a dad that I've got to have great wisdom to say, you know what, if I insulated them from every single pain, hurt, and suffering, then I'm just going to raise a China doll that will be easily shattered. And so I can't just insulate them from everything. There are moments when I've got to have great discernment and wisdom to know how to let out just enough rope for them so they experience some of that maybe toughens them up, that causes, wisdom doesn't come easily. It comes when you navigate through pain and suffering. But here's the thing, as a dad, there are times when I have to do this and take a step back and go, that's gonna hurt. That is going to hurt, but I'm right here. Now, as a father, it would deeply grieve my heart if their response to that was to blame me, accuse me, reject me for that experience. What I want them to do is I want them to lean into me. I want them to know I'm right there. And so when my daughters are hurt, they can bury their head in my chest and cry, and I'll be there. That when my son faces something, he and I can go on a walk together and we can discuss it. God will not insulate you from everything, partly because we live in a very broken world, and partly to bring you to this place of spiritual maturity. Now, here's the thing. You can reject him for it if you want. It's your freedom, that's your option. That is a way. The simple thing that I just simply ask you is, what in the world does it get you? What does it get you to reject him in the midst? It's well known that a common tenet of atheism is there is no God, and I'm really angry with him. And you can reject him if you want. And I would simply say that I would affirm your pain, your suffering. I would not diminish it in any way. I would just simply ask you, what does it get you at the end of the day? Or you can lean into him. And what we see from this royal official and this layman is that Jesus will often not cause. This is not a sadistic bait. Like, hey, watch this. I'm going to cause pain and suffering so they lean into me. That's not what he does. It is that he will allow it for the purpose of raising our eyes to a spiritual reality. Here's application handle number 2. Jesus will meet you right where you are struggling to believe. What I want us to see is that these guys have a weak and tepid faith. They do not get it all figured out. They do not come to Jesus with all the answers. In fact, the last guy is totally clueless as to who Jesus is, revealing to us that Jesus is searching for you long before you ever search for him. And most commonly, how people come to faith, I think there's really 3 ways, because we've already said Jesus is the logic of God. God doesn't make full sense until we get Jesus. And there's 3 primary ways that people come to place their belief or their faith, their trust in Jesus Christ. The first would be what I would simply call the weight of his person. Meaning, have you ever been in a room with a really important person? You ever been in a room that somebody that's well known, somebody deeply respected, and you get up and you talk to them and you're like, you're not yourself because you just feel the weightiness of their authority? This is this idea. Some of you came to believe because you got into the presence of Christ and you came to believe by the weight of his person, but not all of you. Some of you have come to believe by the power of his word. This is the people in Sychar. This is exposure to God's word. This is why we teach through whole books of the Bible, and you may not get it after 1 week or 2 weeks or 6 months or 1 year, but I fully believe a steady diet of God's exposited word as it's explained and applied, eventually the power of that will seed itself in your heart, and the result of it, the fruit of it, will be belief. But not all of you. For some of you, you need to experience the work of Christ in your life. Some sort of what we might call miraculous event. And here's what a miraculous event is. Have you ever noticed, and we'll see this through the Gospel of John, when Jesus does a miracle, he doesn't draw attention to it. He actually tries to diminish it. He'll actually walk up to somebody and heal them and say, hey, do me a favor, don't talk about this. I don't know about you, but if I could do that, I'd say, hey, if you could you post that on social media? What I just did to you there. I'd like more people to know about that. All right. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus says, don't talk about it. He disappears into the crowd. So this is what a miraculous event is the sovereign grace of Christ bumping you up over the barrier that you can't get over on your own. It's mysterious. I don't know how it works. It's even a little bit uncomfortable to talk about. But I know I've seen examples of it. A few weeks ago, I was at a men's retreat in Crawfordsville, and there was some men that stood up and gave their testimonies. There was one guy I believe he's in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, but he was talking about his conversion as a younger man, I think somewhere in the decade of his 30s, if I'm not mistaken. And he was talking about how he and his wife, their marriage was on the rocks, things were coming apart at the seams, and he was estranged from his kids, but he goes to a bar late one night, he has too much to drink, he goes out, gets on his motorcycle at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, which is not a good combination. He's racing home on his motorcycle. It begins to fishtail on him, and he loses control, thrown off of his bike, and he says he's on a 2-lane road. He's sitting down. He's flat on his bottom, legs out in front of him, sitting up, sliding down the opposite lane in the road at 65 miles an hour. He looks over to the side and sees his motorcycle flipping beside him. And he goes, I maintained my consciousness through the whole thing, which I'm going, I don't think I'd want that. I think I'd want to be knocked out, right? And not remember it. But he says he's sitting there, sliding down the road at 65 miles an hour, and he's fully conscious and aware. And he says it's as if everything slowed down, and he started to just think very clearly. His first thought was, this isn't good. Like he was fully aware that there could be another car coming in the oncoming lane. They wouldn't see him in time. It was kind of like over a little hill. He said, man, I could slide off the road into a fence or into a tree or a pole, and that would be the end of me. And as he's sliding, he says, it was as if he had a divine moment with the Lord. That's where Christ came and plucked him, if you will. And he said what he did was he slid to a stop. Like he just like stopped right in the middle of the road. And he stands up, brushes himself off. He had a few scrapes and bruises. That was it, walked away. And he said, at that moment, everything changed. It was a miraculous event, the grace of God that bumped him up over his hump of belief. Now here's the dangerous thing about talking about that, is that as people, we either want to be skeptical of it or explain it away, or we want one of those for ourselves. Not the whole accident thing, but something miraculous, right? And here's the thing about it. That example is descriptive, not prescriptive. And you understand the difference, you see, is that it's not a prescription for salvation. Well, I guess I got to get into like a really bad accident and have like this cognitive experience where everything slows down. No. That's the act of God's grace in that one individual's life. Some of you have had that experience. Some of you have not. Some of you haven't needed it. And Jesus certainly won't draw a whole bunch of attention to it because he doesn't want you to miss the Christ for the miracle. But if you need it, he just might, in the goodness of his grace, give you one. Here's the third application of handle. Jesus will deconstruct what you think you know. He'll deconstruct it. Now, for many of us, this is not an issue of trying to come up with saving faith. It's more of an issue of asking or articulating this simple thing. What does my unbelief demand? Have you ever sat down and articulated that? Those of you who are struggling to believe, just make a list. What does my unbelief demand? Well, I would believe if I had more proof. That's what that is. I would believe if God would reveal himself. I would believe if this issue would get resolved. That's what your unbelief demands. I would just simply ask you to make a list, not look for simple, trite answers, but make a list. Keep it in your Bible, keep it on your nightstand, keep it where you will see it on a regular basis, and just simply say this, okay, God, that's what my unbelief demands. Now let me just give that to you on a daily basis and see what you might do with it. I think you'd be surprised. And it may not come in a day, it may not come in a month, it may not come in a year, but eventually Jesus will deconstruct what you think you know. Here's the fourth application handle, it's simply this. Jesus offers you and I something we can never achieve on our own. These two real-life conversations are parables of salvation. That he comes to these guys and he says, you can't do anything on your own. It's my power in your life. And one of the things, as long as God gives me breath, as long as God blesses me with the ministry of this church, I will continue to contend for on a regular basis, is to help us to understand. I'm going to sound like a broken record. And a record is what we used to listen to music a long time ago. I'm going to sound like a broken iPod. I'm going to continue to put this before you, is that there is a difference between the gospel and religion. And that's what's confusing us. That's what some of you are rejecting. And so I would just simply say this. You want to know what the difference is between a Christian and a religious person? Because they look a lot alike, but there's a subtle difference. The difference between a Christian and a religious person. They both pray, they both read their Bible, they both have maybe had some sort of a conversion experience, they both go to church, they both repent of sin. But the difference between a Christian and a religious person is a Christian repents of their righteousness because it's flawed and because it'll crush you or it'll lead to pride. And for some of you are giving me a really weird look right now. Don't feel bad. All three services have. Repent of righteousness? What in the world? We've got to understand our attempts at righteousness may be the very things that are keeping us from Christ. You come like this, not like this. The difference between a Christian and a religious person, you know you've got it, is when you say, Lord, I not only repent of the bad things that I've done, I repent of the good things I've tried to do, thinking that by that I'll be saved. That's the difference. So here's what I want to ask you to do. We're going to close up. I want to ask everybody to close their eyes right now. And I know that there's somebody in this room that's a lot like me. Whenever a preacher, when I was growing up, would say, close your eyes, I would not. And I want to ask you to close your eyes, and not because I'm telling you to, not because this is some sort of reverent moment, but just out of privacy of the people around you. That people need to know that nobody's looking, all right? Here's what I want to ask you to do. If you're here right now and you're struggling to believe, but honestly, there's at least something inside of you that would like to believe, but there are some barriers. Would you just simply raise up your hand real quick? You can put it right back down. I want to believe, but I'm going to be honest and say that there's some barriers to that belief. Just raise up your hand, put it right back down. Now, all 3 services, there were a number of hands that went up. And I want you to know that this is a safe place for you to bring your questions, safe place for you to bring your baggage, safe place for you to bring your brokenness, and Jesus will meet you there. Let me pray for you. Father, I come to you and I thank you for every person that raised up their hands and the people who didn't have the courage to. And Father, I pray that you would meet them right where they're at, that you would help them, whatever barrier is existing to their full-on belief. Some people here, they would say, you know what, 6 months ago, I was a lot closer with the Lord than I am now, and I've taken some step backs, I've regressed. And God, I pray that you would meet them right where they are and help them get back over that. And so I just lift them up to you now. With eyes still closed, here's what I want to ask you to do. One final thing is that if right now, if you can't, I want you to think of the name or a face of a person that you want to come to know Jesus Christ sometime within the next year. Or maybe this is a person you need to be burdened for. Maybe this is a spouse, it's a child, it's a coworker. If you can think of a name, if you can think of a face of somebody that you want to see come to believe, would you just simply stand to your feet right now? Just as a representative of that person. Say, man, my heart is burdened for them. I don't have a spirit of superiority over them. I don't feel like I've got more knowledge than this other person. I just want them to know Christ. Now, if you look around the room, it's okay to open your eyes now. You see the fair number of the room is standing. In all 3 services, this has been this way. As a church, the people that are represented by your stance here is why we exist. To help lead people to Jesus Christ and help mature them in Him. And there is so much confusion in the world right now. There is so much uncertainty around the world. And people need the truth of Jesus Christ in their life, not so that we are proven that we are right and their religion is wrong, but that Jesus is the righteousness that we can never be. And what righteousness means is He'll make things right. So, Father, I come to you now and I just lift up the people that are represented by this standing room. And I pray that you would meet them where they are. I know that some people, the barrier is their own intellect. For some people, their barrier is a hurt or a wound. For some people, it's laziness. And God, I pray that you would ignite our church on fire, that people would see an authenticity in us because of the person of Jesus Christ. And so we give this to you now. We ask this in Jesus' name. Right now, the ushers are going to come and we're going to respond through communion and the returning of our tithes and offerings. The team will lead us in one more song. Feel free to take a seat as the ushers come now.